and welcome to the Modern Context Podcast. I'm your host, Yasmin Aaliyah Khan, and if you're new here, I'm so happy that you're here. If you're back, thank you for coming back. I'm very glad to have you. I hope all of you have had a very nice couple of weeks since the last episode. I know I took some time off, and I'm sorry for leaving you hanging with part 2 of this Ireland story. But, I hope you had a happy and safe St. Patrick's Day if that was something that you partook in. And I hope that you also had a happy and safe Easter or spring equinox, however you chose to celebrate the season. Anyway, that's it for the intro because we have a lot to get to in this episode. It's going to be a long one. So real quick, as I mentioned, this is part 2 of the story of Ireland. So obviously, if you missed the previous episode, you might want to check that one out first. If not, you'll miss out on some really good background and some helpful info and some good or some really bad history, some really terrible history. We left off in the mid-1850s when the British were effectively starving the Irish people to death and driving others to flee. Either way, the Irish people were clearing out of Ireland and the land was opening up for whomever wanted in, namely the British. So let's start part 2 of this story in the 1860s with the Fenian Rising. If you've watched Peaky Blinders, you might recall that they talk quite a lot about the Fenians, especially in the first season. In the last podcast episode, in part 1, I mentioned that during the famine, the British noticed that crime and unrest were taking over Ireland, go figure, so they started to fear an uprising. Rather than doing what they could to quell the unrest, and there really was a lot they could have done, they only made it worse. Happy people do not rise up against oppressors because they don't need to. Happy people make up a happy and peaceful society. So, in the face of unhappy, oppressed people, you have 2 choices. You can either do what you can to make them happier and alleviate their societal tension, or you can attempt to oppress them further. Further oppression only serves to build more pressure, and oppressive measures become more difficult and more costly to maintain under that increasing pressure. So, the oppressive British were right to fear an uprising. And in 1867, not long after the famine, they got one. But first, who were the Fenians? This is a term that was attributed to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or the IRB, but they were a secret society that was fighting for Ireland's independence from British rule. They had chapters in the US and Canada as Irish people had to flee from the famine, and the word Fenian was often used as a derogatory term, usually by Protestants against Irish Catholics. Now, real quick, whenever I refer to nationalists or Republicans, I'm talking about the Irish people who wanted an independent Ireland, usually the Catholics. Whenever I refer to Unionists or Loyalists, I'm talking about people living in Ireland who wanted Ireland to be a part of the United Kingdom, people who were loyal to the British Crown. These were typically the Protestants living in the northern counties of Ulster. Throughout the 1850s and 60s, in the aftermath of the famine, Irish nationalism had been becoming increasingly popular, and the idea of a rebellion against British monarchical and imperial rule was becoming more and more attractive. The British had outlawed criticism of the government, either spoken or written, so Irish dissidents had no choice but to go underground. However, the Irish people were physically weak, relatively unorganized, underfunded, and generally just no match for the British Army. So they created the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a secret society. As they organized their efforts against the British, they relied on support from their Irish comrades overseas in America. Unfortunately, just as talks of a rebellion were kicking off, so was the American Civil War. Thousands of Irishmen joined in the war on either side, which led to thousands of Irish deaths at the hands of other Irishmen. Additionally, the British Army was full of Irishmen, but they weren't particularly loyal to Britain. They were just serving because they needed the money. Many of them had promised to defect against the British when the time for Irish rebellion came, but when that time did come, it was a disaster. The British had by then established some pretty robust spy networks in Ireland, so plans for rebellion were difficult secrets to keep. Its leaders were sold out to the British by spies, and its plans were leaked. The Fenian Rising of 1867 was quickly put down. Those involved in the rising were killed, sent to penal colonies, or sent to Australia. The rising fell and failed, but the spirit of it didn't. By 1886, the United Kingdom had a Liberal Prime Minister who proposed the Government of Ireland Bill, also known as the First Home Rule Bill. It was known as the first because it didn't pass the first time it was introduced. It wouldn't have given the Irish complete independence from Britain, but it would have given them more governance over themselves. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who had pretty much drafted the bill all by himself, said in a speech defending it, quote, "Gentlemen speak of tightening the ties between England and Ireland as if tightening the tie were always the means to be adopted. Tightening the tie is frequently the means of making it burst, whilst relaxing the tie is very frequently the way to provide for its durability and to enable it to stand a stronger strain." That's basically what I said earlier about oppressive pressure, but I'll concede that he said it better. He went on to argue that usually when one country tries to strengthen its grip on another, the end result is a far worse relationship between the two. At this point, the Prime Minister isn't necessarily advocating for Irish independence because he believes it's the right thing to do. He believes that allowing the Irish to govern themselves by loosening that British grip on them would actually make Ireland easier for Britain to hold. He also regularly cited what happened with the American colonies not even a century earlier. He said, quote, "I must further say that we have proposed this measure because Ireland wants to make her own laws. It is not enough to say that you are prepared to make good laws. You were prepared to make good laws for the colonies. You did make good laws for the colonies according to the best of your light. The colonies were totally dissatisfied with them." The crux of his argument seems to come down to this, quote, "The difference between giving with freedom and dignity on the one side, with acknowledgement and gratitude on the other, and giving with compulsion, giving with disgrace, giving with resentment, dogging you at every step of your path, the difference is, in our eyes, fundamental." He's saying that the quote-unquote Irish question will have to be addressed eventually, inevitably, either the easy way or the hard way. If they want to do it his way, the easy way, with the Government of Ireland Bill, it'll be much easier and much better for all involved. Otherwise, the question will just continue to be raised again and again, next time under more contentious circumstances, and Britain runs the risk of suffering another humiliating, deadly, and costly loss like it did with the American colonies. Anyway, the bill didn't pass. Unionist Protestant opposition defeated the bill, but just as Gladstone said would happen, the Irish question would continue to be raised. In 1905, Arthur Griffith founded the Sinn Féin Party of Ireland. In English, this translates to "we," ourselves, and as the name would suggest, it was the Irish Republican Party. The party struggled to find support initially, but that would change over time. In 1910, the British Liberals were having a hard time defeating the Conservatives, so they partnered with John Redmond, the head of the Irish Parliamentary Party, or the IPP. With an alliance between Redmond and the Liberal leader, Herbert Henry Asquith, Asquith became Prime Minister. In exchange for Redmond's support, he supported Irish Home Rule, eventually getting it passed. Fun fact, Asquith is actress Helena Bonham Carter's great-grandfather. Another fun fact, the British Conservative leader at the time was none other than Arthur Balfour. Balfour achieved his position in British government thanks in large part to nepotism, and he opposed Irish Home Rule because he did not believe in any kind of, let's call it, two-state solution. During his time as the Chief Secretary for Ireland, he earned the nickname Bloody Balfour when he defended a massacre in which 3 Irish protesters were killed by police and several others were shot. He is, of course, best known for the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which he declared, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." Anyway, in 1912, seeing this alliance between Asquith and Redmond, Unionists in the North got worried and formed the Ulster Volunteers, a paramilitary operation that sought to block British efforts to implement Irish Home Rule, doing so by force if they had to. In response, with backing from the IRB, the Irish nationalists formed their own paramilitary group, the Irish Volunteers. Meanwhile, the Irish Citizens' Army, a third militia, was forming in Dublin, comprised of workers who had been locked out of work by leaders who didn't want them unionizing. In 1914, right around the start of World War I, Irish Home Rule actually passed. However, since Britain was now at war with the world, they put Ireland's Home Rule on hold for a bit. With World War I, Redmond suggested that the Irish Volunteers fight alongside the British and even the Ulster Volunteers in order to maintain a strong, positive relationship with Britain, just as they were about to grant Ireland Home Rule. The majority of them did just that, becoming the National Volunteers. The remaining Irish Volunteers stayed back, their numbers far less than before, and their political stance seen as more radical than most Irish people were comfortable with. Over the next couple of years, the IRB would strengthen its hold on the Volunteers, adopting and ratifying a constitution. They also began importing arms into Ireland, working in cahoots with the Germans to do so. And this brings us to Easter 1916. With Britain still at war, the Volunteers decided to stage a rising on Easter. It didn't go as planned. First, their chief of staff, Ian McNeill, didn't think it was a good idea and opposed it. However, at this point, the Volunteers, which was infiltrated by the IRB, was also working with the Irish Citizens' Army. They were going to go through with the rising whether or not they had McNeill's support. They sent a fake letter to McNeill telling him that the British were planning to arrest him and other nationalist leaders. Meanwhile, the British had found out about a large shipment of arms coming in from Germany, and they intercepted it. So now McNeill doesn't like any of this. On one hand, he doesn't want to betray the Irish nationalist cause, but on the other hand, he thinks that these other guys are acting way too hastily and very irrationally. The way he sees it, there is no way that they can win this fight against the British, especially now that the British have blocked their arms shipment. So then, McNeill contacts nationalist leaders across the country, telling them that the upcoming meetings regarding the rising are canceled. In response, the other leaders simply postponed their rising for the following day, but McNeill's efforts were successful in disorienting the plans. Only about 1,200 men turn up for the rising in Dublin, far less than were originally planned. Still, with the British Army busy with World War I, the rebels were able to declare Ireland a new republic. With this declaration, the rising garnered more public support, with hundreds of volunteers joining the rising as it was happening. However, some were still concerned about maintaining good relations with the British, at least while they had Irishmen fighting alongside the British in the war. Those in the latter group would soon flip on the British, though, following the British response to the rising. So let's take a step out. You have a group of people who have been oppressed for centuries, really, but let's say decades in the then modern era. Those oppressed people, who have far fewer resources than their oppressors, finally rise up against them in a way that gets their attention. The oppressors then respond by cutting off transportation routes, declaring martial law, bringing in thousands of troops, 20,000 troops against maybe 2,000 Irish rebels, and destroying the city of Dublin, reducing it to ruins with their giant war machines, machine guns, artillery, and shells. The British response to the rising was so swift and so brutal and so disproportionate that it would truly unite the Irish people against them, even the ones who had previously sought to maintain friendly relations with these people who had historically not been friendly to them. Over the course of 6 days, nearly 500 people had been killed, over half of whom were Irish civilians, many of whom were children. The first person to die was a nurse who was shot by a British sniper as she was tending to the wounded. In the aftermath of the rising, the rebel leaders were brutally and systematically executed. Martial law persisted, and the British took full advantage, arresting 3,500 Irish people without probable cause, and either executing or imprisoning many of them without trial. And the Irish people, now more united against the British than ever, were ready to fight. The Easter Rising was disastrous in a few different ways, but it was a pivotal moment in Ireland's history. The people had risen up against the British Empire, the largest empire in the world, and their own personal neighbors and bullies. Immediately following the rising, the British had put nearly 2,000 Irishmen into internment camps. The population of these camps were typically young, Catholic Irishmen, and many of them had little or nothing to do with the rising. So while they were in these camps, they just became more and more organized and radicalized against the British. In 1918, 2 years after the rising, the Sinn Féin party ran a campaign promoting Irish independence. That year, they won 73 out of 105 seats in Ireland. However, the winners of those seats practiced something called abstentionism, which means that even though they'd won the seats in Westminster, they wouldn't sit in them. Instead, they formed their own parliament in Dublin and declared Ireland an independent republic. And predictably, this did not sit well with the British nor with the Ulster Unionists, so war was inevitable. The first shots were fired in 1919, when a group of Irishmen attacked officers of the Royal Irish Constabulary, or the RIC. Basically, these were British police in Ireland. The Irish stole the RIC officers' weapons, and then they kept going. Irish people across the land began raiding RIC barracks and stealing those weapons. But this war wasn't just fought with arms, it was fought with intelligence. Spies and double agents were everywhere. Those loyal to the crown were quick to send intelligence back to London, so Irish resistance had to be more deliberate at targeting and taking down those loyalists. Through these resistance efforts, the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, was born. The Irish War for Independence would be fought between the British forces and the IRA. Winston Churchill, at the time, was the British Secretary of State for War. At this point, World War II was over, so Churchill sent war vets into Ireland as a special forces unit. They became known as the Black and Tans, and they were brutal. They burned Irish cities and exacted revenge against the IRA on civilians. The war proceeded in this way, with each side trying to outsmart and outspy the other. In the north, the Ulster Volunteers were on the side of the British, fighting against the possibility of Irish and Catholic rule. They understood that they were part of the Protestant minority in Ireland, but they were a minority with power. However, even though the Protestants mostly lived in the north, plenty of Catholics still lived there. The province of Derry, or Londonderry for example, was very Catholic and sided with the nationalists. The north became more viciously segregated, with Catholics being driven out of their homes and jobs by the Ulster Volunteers and the British officers. Meanwhile, the British had to send more spies into Ireland because the IRA was effectively targeting the ones who were already over there. The Irish still refused to participate in the British legal system or parliament, so legal and diplomatic progress was slow or completely stalled. The British started arresting and detaining suspected IRA members without probable cause, and they continued to employ brutal war tactics against the Irish. Then came Bloody Sunday, November 21st, 1920. By the way, this is not the Bloody Sunday from the U2 song. That's a different Bloody Sunday that we'll talk about later. On this Sunday in 1920, 13 British operatives were killed in Dublin systematically and deliberately. In response, the British auxiliary officers opened fire on a crowd at a football match, killing 14 people. Finally, after all of this and more, a few weeks after Bloody Sunday, the British Parliament signed the Government of Ireland Act, granting Ireland home rule and partitioning the island. The British Parliament agreed to recognize the Dublin Parliament, but they also established a parliament in Belfast. The 6 counties in the north that were still mostly loyal to the Crown would form Northern Ireland and be served by the Belfast Parliament. The rest of Ireland, including 3 northern counties, would become Southern Ireland, and they would be served by the Dublin Parliament. So this wasn't ideal, but because the Sinn Féin members of British Parliament were practicing abstention, they weren't involved in the decision to partition the island. They also didn't love the fact that even with the partition imposed upon them, they were still technically part of the UK. So while the British, who loved to partition other people's homes, thought that they had landed on a pretty swell compromise, for the Irish it simply was not good enough. The IRA went somewhat underground, but the worst of the war was yet to come. The British officers became more brutal in their attacks against IRA members, and they began searching homes for hidden IRA members. Meanwhile, the IRA leadership was beginning to split over disagreements on how best to win the war. Both sides of the IRA wanted the same thing, they just had different ideas on how best to achieve it. Finally, with the IRA hanging by a thread and both sides suffering losses, the British called for a ceasefire. This ceasefire eventually led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. The formerly Southern Ireland became the Irish Free State, and the 6 northern counties remained as Northern Ireland and remained as part of the United Kingdom. Notably, the partition was never presented as a permanent solution. Also notably, the Irish Free State wasn't yet the Republic of Ireland that we know today. This Irish Free State was still a dominion of the British Empire, but for the most part, the people of the Irish Free State were able to govern themselves for the first time. All right, I know that we're still 100 years away from the modern era, but the rest of this will go a lot more quickly. After the treaty, the IRA was split into the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty factions. Some took the win for the win, thinking it was at least a step in the right direction, and that now that they were able to govern themselves, they would be in a better position to actually achieve full independence. For others, it simply wasn't good enough. They felt that it was just an appeasement measure, where the British were still able to retain a hold on the Irish without having to deal with the inconveniences of risings or discontent or the IRA. Also, the treaty wasn't perfect. The Irish were still under the British crown, their land was partitioned, and the British kept 3 naval bases in Ireland for themselves. With the disagreement between the two sides, the IRA split. On one side, you had Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, who had formed a provisional government for the Free State of Ireland. On the other side, you had Eamon de Valera, the former president of the Republic, who resigned in protest after the Irish Parliament, or the Dáil, voted to accept the treaty. By 1922, the two sides were at all-out war with each other, with the new Irish National Army being backed by the British. The anti-treaty IRA had plenty of supporters on its side, but lacking weaponry and resources, they often had to resort to guerrilla warfare against their fellow Irishmen. Both sides engaged in a multi-front war, with the Free State passing a public safety bill, which gave them free rein to execute any IRA members bearing arms against the Free State. In return, the IRA targeted and killed anyone who voted for the bill. The Cumann Amman, the Women's Council, aided the anti-treaty IRA by acting as spies, and the Free State had the Catholic Church denounce the women and their political roles. The church also stopped issuing sacrament to IRA members. Both sides captured prisons and executed them at strategic moments. Homes were burned, and eventually, the Civil War had become a war of attrition. In 1923, the anti-treaty IRA surrendered, citing excessive losses and lack of resources. With the Civil War ended, the pro-treaty Sinn Féin became the Society of the Gaels, and later they rebranded to the far-right pseudo-fascist Fine Gael. The anti-treaty Sinn Féin became Fianna Fáil, which means soldiers or warriors of destiny, and by 1932, they would win control of the government in the general election. Both parties are still active in Irish government today, except Fine Gael is less fascist than it used to be. And now that there was no more fighting, governing could happen, and just as the pro-treaty side had advocated for all along, Eamon de Valera, who is now the Prime Minister, worked to transition the Irish Free State from a constitutional monarchy under the British Crown to an independent republic, deliberately and systematically dismantling the Anglo-Irish Treaty. By 1937, a new constitution was ratified and Ireland was declared independent. By 1949, the Republic of Ireland that we know today would be born. While the nation was no longer at war with the British or with themselves, old prejudices remained, especially in Northern Ireland. These conflicts became particularly violent over a 30-year period spanning from the early 1970s to the late 1990s, which would come to be known as the Troubles. Segregation between the Protestants and Catholics was common in Northern Ireland, and tensions came to a head in 1969 at the Battle of the Bogside. A Protestant parade was moving through Derry, which was predominantly Catholic, and riots erupted between the two sides. Police did less to quell the violence and more to escalate it. The riots lasted 3 days and resulted in hundreds of people injured, at which point British troops were called in to play peacekeeper. But rather than being the neutral party that they were promised to be, the British troops were soon in cahoots with the Ulster Loyalists, often opposing the Catholic nationalists more than protecting them. They also began the practice of internment, detaining nationalist agitators without cause or due process. January 30th, 1972, there was an anti-internment protest in Derry in the Bogside area. The British troops, who were really the ones being protested, turned up to manage the protest, but the crowd soon turned on them. Protesters started throwing rocks at the troops, and the troops responded with gunshots. 28 people were shot, 14 were killed, others were beaten or injured with rubber bullets and police batons. 2 were run over by British vehicles. All of the victims were Catholic, many of them were teenagers. The day would come to be known as Bloody Sunday or the Bogside Massacre, and Bono wrote a song about it. Tensions between the two sides would escalate for decades, until both sides became exhausted. Over 3,500 people would be killed in Northern Ireland, many of them civilians. Still, peace talks constantly faltered for one reason or another. Finally, following years of tenuous negotiations, the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, was signed on April 10, 1998. The agreement outlined 3 major tenets. 1, that the people of Northern Ireland would democratically decide whether or not to align with the UK or with the rest of Ireland. 2, equal rights for all. And 3, that Northern Irish people could themselves identify and be accepted as Irish, British, or both. Today, things are far from perfect, but for the first time since the partition, Northern Ireland has expressed interest in reuniting with the rest of Ireland. The process for reunification is simple enough. If it seems like the people of Northern Ireland want to reunite with the Republic of Ireland, both sides would have to hold a referendum. If it passes on both sides, then it's done. So why does it look like we might finally be headed in this direction? Well, for one, in 2022, Sinn Féin became the first Irish nationalist party to win the majority seats in the Northern Irish Assembly. Also, Catholics for the first time outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland, although those religious divisions fall less in alignment with political divisions than they did before. Additionally, the number of Northern Irish people who identify as Irish rather than British is increasing. And Liam Neeson is optimistic that he'll see a united Ireland in his lifetime, and that has to count for something. I should clarify that as of now, the support for reunification isn't quite where it needs to be, but things are trending in that direction. They're saying that reunification is possible by the year 2030, but between now and then, I expect we'll see both sides campaigning to win over those undecided voters, of which there are a good chunk. I also expect that the decision to reunite with Ireland or remain in the UK will come down to economics, whether or not the overall quality of life would be better for the people of Northern Ireland if they were to leave the UK. If and when Ireland does decide to reunite, it would be historic indeed and a long and difficult time coming. This story, I feel like between this podcast, my last podcast, the blog I had before that, and my work with the Young Turks, I've covered some pretty gruesome stories, heartbreaking stories, stories of injustice and generational trauma and genocide and war. And every time I start researching a topic, I always try to stay as open-minded as possible. I don't like to presume too much, and even after I do these types of episodes, I still hold a little bit of grace for myself, and I hope you all do too, because there will always be so much more that can and should be said about the things the people involved in these historical episodes experienced. There will always be so much more to consider when formulating your opinions and feelings around what happened and why it happened. And even the facts, historians debate with each other all the time about how things went down in the past and what any or all of it meant. But as you do your research and just learn more, not only do you become painfully aware of that which you still do not know and will never know, but inevitably you start to feel things. You start to empathize with the stories you read and the people you read about. You start to feel sad, you start to feel angry, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you're allowed to feel a moment of hope. This work, and I love what I do, it's hard on your heart. And for every horrible tale of struggle and strife and victimization and more, I've never cried while working on something until now. Ireland is the one that got me, which was very unexpected. And I almost don't like telling you that because I feel like it diminishes the experiences of other people and other nations, and I certainly don't mean for it to. But do you know which part of this story got me? It was the part about the Native Americans helping out the Irish during the potato famine, which we determined in the previous episode was actually more of a deliberate starvation initiative or even a genocide than a naturally occurring famine. But the story of the American tribes who scraped up whatever little they had to send to the Irish, maybe that made me cry because I was experiencing that little bit, that rare bit of hope that I was just talking about. The indigenous people of the United States had just suffered their own loss of land and loss of dignity with the Trail of Tears having just been a few years prior. Perhaps they saw themselves in the Irish. They recognized the plight of the Irish. Maybe they recognized attempted genocide for what it was, despite all of the attempts to launder the narrative behind the guise of a famine. And I don't mean to throw that word around flippantly, but the fact that we're so reluctant or trepidatious about using the word genocide really illustrates the fact that the victors are the ones who write the history. They're the ones who get to determine what that cleaned up narrative will sound like, not just in the future, but while it's happening. It can be happening in front of our eyes, and we wouldn't recognize it for what it is because we've been taught to avert our eyes from the word itself. We've been taught not to hear it, let alone speak it. We were taught not to think it. I remember growing up in New England, and there were plenty of towns, bodies of waters, even states' names that had names derived from the native tribes who had once lived there. And we learn about them in school, the very cleaned up version that you get, of the first Thanksgiving and Squanto, etc. And I remember being confused about, okay, but where are they now? Where did they go? And I was living in the area where all of this took place. But the part of where are they now is just conveniently not mentioned. I'm sitting there in Connecticut. Where did that name come from? I'm sitting there in a classroom full of Black kids, white kids, Puerto Ricans, and a handful of Asians, not one Native American kid that I know of. Growing up in this country is a peculiar experience on a psychological level, or maybe on an emotional level, because some people really don't care about the fact that so many people had to either be killed or displaced in order for them to live where they are, living the lives that they're living. Living in the United States, whether your ancestors were colonizers, slaves, or refugees, you live here with the understanding that someone else lived here first, and you understand that it probably wasn't their choice to move somewhere else. And the people who choose not to care about these sorts of things say things like, well, the past is the past. People move around all the time, borders change all the time. And that's true. But the part that they keep burying, the part that they keep leaving out, is that while natural anthropological shifts and patterns do occur, the unnatural ones are deliberate, often acute, and highly destructive. And I'm not talking about natural disasters or freak catastrophic events when I talk about natural shifts. By the way, those happen too, and they inflict their own kind of trauma on the victims, and they have their own historical relevance. But the ones that are initiated and perpetuated by man against man, those are evil. And I don't want to make this Irish story about something or someone else entirely, but all I'll say is that there is a reason why the Irish people have been so overwhelmingly supportive of the people of Palestine, not just now, but always. It's the same reason why the Native Americans of the mid-1800s were supportive of the Irish. Irish history is one of those topics that Americans have a particular affinity for, and I can only reasonably assume that that's because so many Americans can trace their lineage back to Ireland. Even I have Celtic knots on my engagement ring because my fiance's ancestry is part Irish. And what's interesting about that, and a bit sad in my personal opinion, is that there is nothing about the way he or his family lived their lives that is obviously Irish. Ireland was generations ago. There are no lingering traditions from Ireland that got passed down through those generations. No value system, no artisanry, no lore, superstitions, no nothing. He doesn't even really know when his ancestors came here or why they came. Maybe it was because of the famine, but maybe it wasn't. Me, on the other hand, my roots are Indian, but there was a whole stint in the British West Indies that happened between the time when my ancestors left India and when I was born in Connecticut. Now, while so much of my cultural identity is still very much rooted in Indian culture, it's kind of a diluted version of it. After living in a British colony for a few generations, my people no longer speak Hindi or Urdu or any other Indian dialect, apart from a few words here and there that stuck around. Our food, religious traditions, music, etc. still obviously originate in Indian culture, but in a way we sort of just have our own thing now. The diaspora has taken on its own identity. In a few more generations, the cultural dilution will look more like cultural erasure, and what happened to the Black and white people of this particular country will happen to the brown. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't take long for that transformation to occur. It doesn't take long for people to become disconnected from where they came from the people who made them, from the culture that fed them. But roots are rife with struggle, and in my very personal opinion again, those roots and the struggle should not only be honored, but they should be protected. And on that note, that is a wrap for this very long episode of the Modern Context podcast. Until next time, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to the show at hello@modconpod.com with any suggestions or questions you might have for us. Also, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on YouTube and tell your friends about us. And of course, thank you all very much for listening.